Welcome to You with Intention. I'm your host, Cassandra, and this is the podcast where we help you move from mindset into embodiment with real talk, rituals, and soul-aligned structure that helps you live your life and your purpose with intention. Athena Laz is a dear friend of mine. She's a mastermind sister. She is a best-selling author, and she's an expert on dreams, consciousness, intuition, and she's written a book called Women Who Dance in the Dark, Awakening Your Inner Seer. We are discussing what I feel like is an entire newly anointed archetype coming into our collective consciousness that does have, historical significance, but so many of us are not aware of or connected to the medial muse or the medial archetype, right? And we're going to dive in this conversation about how we can honor this part of ourselves, show up for this part of ourselves, and how our entire life expands when we start awakening the seer that is within all of us, that has that connection to that divine wisdom. Both me and Athena share some really personal stories of our own journey, listening to and not listening to the nudges that we've received over the years and its impact on us. And I think you're just going to love this episode. But before we dive in, I do want to let you know we have some new exciting offerings. I have been just reinventing and switching up so much stuff, since giving birth and just reinvigorating this, what is this next chapter for me? And one of the things that I've personally loved receiving so much and wanted to offer is audio recording readings. And so essentially I have two different types of offers that have never existed before that are a audio recorded message from me. One is a simple ask anything. If you have been just dying to pick my brain on a certain topic, maybe it's like I want to publish my first book. I don't even know where to start. Maybe it's something like I'm struggling in my coaching business. Here's why. Maybe you're struggling to find, I just had a client last week where we were coming up with what is the most ideal meditation practice for her based on her specific goals. You're wanting to manifest something and it's been blocked. If you've had a question and you just wish that you could voice memo me on the phone and receive that answer back from me, this is the offer for you. The second thing is also an audio recording, and this is based on my sacred structure that I have been talking about. So you give me your birth chart info, and I'm going to look at your astrology and your human design and send you a little voice memo with the ideal elements to help you plan out your day and your week to truly honor your divine design so you feel the most in flow and productive and inspired and magnetic, of course. I will put the links below for both so you can explore more and see what might be right for you if you're interested. But enough of that. Let's get on with the show. Yay! Athena, I'm so happy to have you back on the podcast, and I can't wait to dive into your new book, Women Who Dance in the Dark. First of all, before I want to talk a little bit about how it is just wild that we are doing this interview and your book's coming out next week, and we're in the middle of this Pisces Virgo eclipse season, and it could not be more aligned timing. But before I explain why, for anyone that's listening, can you let them know, for anyone that's not familiar with that language, the medial woman or the medial archetype, can you let us into a little bit more about that and quote unquote women who dance in the dark?
Well, thank you. It's so wonderful to be joining you in conversation again. And the medial archetype is relatively unknown. It isn't a name people are familiar with, but I feel like that's going to change because collectively, like what you're saying, we are needing new archetypes. So we're in very interesting times collectively. And when that happens, archetypes arise into the imagination of all of us so that they can help us move. So on a very sort of fundamental clear level, the medial archetype is the archetype within us that represents the intuitive, the mediumistic, and the mediator functions within us. And so it's a broad range because we can connect in that way in so many ways. So we can connect, say, mediumistically to the unseen, to spirit, to our multi-dimensional non-physical self. But we can also connect through this archetype with other people. It's a way of relating, and with our own inner worlds. So there's a vast way of working with this archetype. So in essence, it's just a very potent archetype that can help us mediate any conflict, and also to really explore our own intuitive and natural gifts that come along with this kind of archetype.
I love that. And, thinking of it as like the seer, right? Like you were
Mhm.
saying, I think that term also is like the seeing as far as like intuitive sight, but then also seeing like kind of from above the field and like from a higher perspective, and how that kind of also aligns with helping us eliminate conflict. But
Yeah.
I I just love the divine timing of it all, because we're in this Pisces Virgo axis eclipse season. We just had a full moon lunar eclipse in Pisces right before this, and this will be posted before our new moon in Virgo eclipse that's coming up. But I feel like it really, speaks to a lot of the themes that you talk about in your book, where we have Pisces, which is our mystic, right? Which is the part of us, that has our psychic abilities. And looking at that, if you, chances are where you've been hit with this eclipse season is also hitting that area where we have that intuitive sight, where we can access those qualities of ourselves, and then balancing that dynamic with Virgo, which a lot of us, we think about Virgo as um, sometimes like organization and the physical body and health and like all of that jazz. But Virgo originates from the Virgin. And you talk about that a little bit in your book, about how the medial archetype comes back to Mary, or Our Lady of Guadalupe. And one of the things that when we talk about, I'll say like in the non-traditional
Space.
version of Mary, when we think the Virgin Mary, a virgin was really like a woman, like onto herself, like a sovereign woman. And so I feel like it's this beautiful combination where I think a lot of people are really at that time where they're ready to, take those like reins and
Yeah.
say, I do have access to this intuitive power in whichever way it flows through me. And I do need to take charge of my life and make these big changes. You talk about in the book how oftentimes it is during midlife that a lot of women wake up to this archetype within themselves. But you also mentioned, which I relate to a lot, during these times where we have and a big life shifts, where we lose someone really close to us, where we leave the job, or we get laid off, or we move across the country, or we get divorced, or whatever kind of big thing happens, which I also think a lot of people are going through right now with eclipse season. This kind of opens up the gate for us. Can you explain to us how having these kinds of precipice of change moments kind of open us to this medial archetype? And if we're in that space, how do we dive deeper down that direction?
Sure. Thank you. So it's so beautiful in that you're relating this back to astrology, because we see that with astrology so often, or at least to me, right? It's actually an invitation to explore facets of ourselves that sometimes we're very like accustomed to, and other times not so much. But there's also this direct unseen influence that impacts us, right? So whenever we're in this precipice of change, whether that comes willingly or unwillingly, if it's personal or collective, we're always kind of being invited in that moment to step into something potentially new, but there are times when that's a complete unknown. It's when we're in the dark, right? And so in the book was why I share that actually this archetype tends to hit at middle age, because people naturally go through a threshold of change where sort of old ways of doing sort of the old ways of doing things aren't really relevant anymore, or there comes a time where just whatever the shift or the pattern is, whatever the thing is that makes the person arrive at the point that, oh, okay, there is some form of movement that needs to happen, but that I'm not participating in yet. That's when we're invited to be with the mystery, to be in the dark. And the medial archetype comes, at least in my opinion, it rarely arises in any liminal threshold period, in any cusp of cyclical change. The medial archetype is ever present because it is the part of us that can hold the space between knowing and not knowing. And so when we're in that space for however long it is, I often think of women who are pregnant, right? It's such a good in between space in a way, because you're rarely weaving into a new phase of life, and the old part of you is very much changing, and you're in this threshold space. And I think the thing with pregnancy or even midlife is because we're human and we love structure, we project a lot of stuff onto it, right? So, oh, okay, it's the 9 month journey, or it's this mythic initiation, or it's whatever it is. But the medial archetype is really an invitation to go, okay, if I got stripped down to the bare bones of who I am, what remains? And that can be a very potent and powerful journey, but it can also be very painful if you're unprepared, or if there aren't people to hold you in that space. And so, this medial archetype arises to help us really cross thresholds, to be able to lean into sight that we may not have at that time, right? So for any of us in a transitional phase, we can do all the good things, like the logical things, like you were saying, which we need to do. That's part of the balance. You write the lists, you make a plan, you take the action, and you see what lands. And then we integrate the intuitive stuff that makes sure that our alignment is in place before we take that action. But in the middle of that is the medial, that is actually helping us to hold the space between the two. And in that, a new pathway is sort of woven. And so it's very much a journey of trusting. It's very much a journey of releasing. It links back in the way that I share it, the journey in the book, how it links back to Mary, in my opinion, right, is that she's this beautiful divine feminine figure that rarely can, that shows us, whether we believe in that symbolically or more actively, that we are guided when we are in the pathway of the heart. And so it's really learning to drop into that space, specifically when there's real change around us. So many people that I've been speaking to about the book and the media archetype, a lot of us are feeling big collective changes. I think you kind of have to have your head in the sand at the moment to not see that there's a lot of change, and that can make us feel frightened, and it can make us feel overwhelmed. And so the medial archetype appears to, one, show us how to bridge things that we view as very different. For example, AI and humanity is a good example of that, or different political parties, different whatever label of structure or identity we want to place in. And so the medial archetype, it's not so much a doing as it is a being. It's a way of being in the world that helps us collectively move in a way that is much more, it's like, I don't want to say harmonious, because it is, but it's more like equanimity, because if you're in harmony or disharmony, you're still kind of in the duality of it. It's more like equanimity of the two. And so this isn't an archetype that I believe everyone will resonate with. But I do think that the people who feel it very intrinsically will know that, oh, you're the bridge makers in your family, maybe in your community, in your culture, and what does that look like, right? So it's a lot, but it always comes back down to surrendering to the heart, trusting that even if you can't see what's coming up ahead, you really are guided, but that takes a lot of awareness, and a lot of presence. So it's very much about, I think, taking responsibility, but also enjoying the process of it.
Is there anything that you do or you advise clients to do when they're in one of these periods to help activate that way of being on a regular basis for them to kind of like, embody it if it's something that's newer to them?
I think one of the most helpful things to do is for anyone who's experiencing that to just begin to pay attention to their dreams. Archetypes in general, they speak to us. Receive a lot of archetypal information when we sleep and dream, and that's often to help us transform and change. So if someone is watching this or listening to this and they're really in a crux period in life, simply just listening to your dream, incubating the intention that your dreams will be helpful and guide you in a benevolent way, that would be very meaningful. And then you can add the layer of connecting with the medial nature within. And I would use those words specifically as opposed to medial archetype, because I think it's a nice gentle invitation to begin working with that form of energy and presence, right? But then another very pragmatic thing to do is, if you're wanting to receive guidance, and I know you know this so beautifully because you do this so wonderfully in your work, right? You have to be able to, and I say have to, and I mean it, right? You really have to be able to kind of sit still or walk and be able to clear the mind. And so I know a lot of the time suggestions are much more soft in nature, but to me, when it comes to working with this archetype, it's almost like a prerequisite. It doesn't have to be structured though. It could be like you're having a quiet moment cleaning up your house and you're in that very centered, open, receptive place of being. You're going on a walk and you can tap into that same type of energy, or you're sitting down in the morning or evening or whenever is good and just paying attention for 5 minutes to the space beyond thinking, right? So it does take a bit of effort, but it's well worth it, because on the other side, when you work with this archetype, you get heightened discernment. We have so much information coming at us all the time now. We don't know. Most of us don't know what to believe, right? or truth is very fundamental to the perceiver, right? So we have to make sure that what we're perceiving, we're doing that in a good way. So when we begin to work with this archetype, it's very much about like increased discernment, increased intuition, increased ability to mediate tension inside and outside in the world. And that can also be something really simple, like maybe having a specific goal in mind, but then having a feeling or emotional state that isn't on par on or on the same page. And so in that case, the medial archetype super, super helpful, because it shows us, oh, okay, this is the way we can negotiate two different ideas or thoughts or feelings.
Yeah, and I love that you said that this is like a have to, not an optional thing. Because that's like one of the things that, I'm a huge advocate for, but it's, a lot of people, and here's the thing, I don't want to throw anybody specifically under the bus or whatever, but
Right.
like I've heard things about, and here I'm all about like affirmations, and I listen to all the like binaural, like
I
subliminal,
mean,
like you name it, I try all that. But I think one of the things that you touched on that's so important is that like you can be unstructured in what you want to do meditatively, but having that quiet,
yeah,
right? Because we've become a society that is always consuming, right?
right,
And it's so important. Me and one of my guy friends, a few years ago, we would call it, we're doing like a psychic detox, right?
right.
And it would be like we're not listening or watching or letting anything go in, so that we can just have quiet. And in those moments, sometimes, oftentimes I think when people are just starting to open up, they will receive in the shower, right?
Yeah.
Why? Because they're not thinking as they're washing their body and shampooing their hair. Like they're kind of in this like relaxed space where there's quiet. And I love that you brought up like even like cleaning or doing stuff around the house. I
Mm.
myself also like I'm so guilty of when I do that. I'm listening to a podcast or an audiobook, right? And I remind myself that actually that too is an open opportunity and an invitation to allow my intuition to come in if I just allow for some silence and I don't play the thing. But of course, you know me, like my meditation is like that is my jam.
Mm.
And I think that it is this. I've been doing it for like 10 years and I'm still to this day always floored at how I can literally be, you know, like Athena has seen the spectrum of chaos, right? That that can happen, and I can literally be just in total dysregulation and meditate for like 10 minutes and just be like, oh, I just need to do this and this, right? And then, and then I think what happens is like when people are like, I don't know, like how do you like continue to do that? And it's like, oh, like once you like get into that groove and you see, like you were saying, you see the availability of that discernment, you see how all of a sudden you can literally go from like mind chaos to like, I just have these three things. Those are the most important things for me to get done today, or whatever it is, or just like a
Right.
sentence that brings you peace. You know, you're like,
Which is
you'll do
so
it.
amazing.
So,
Yeah. I think what I love about what you're saying so much is that firstly, all of us can relate to that, or almost all of us can relate. I'm saying that in a huge generalization, but what I love about it is that it's so simple. I think so much at the moment is um like, you know, we have so much information coming at us, like you're saying, right? That actually sometimes practices that are very intense in nature just add to that. And I hear a lot of people saying to me, you know, well, I want to do this, but like nothing's happening. So I've been sitting down and nothing is happening. And sometimes that's, you know, can be for quite a long period of time. Sometimes it's much shorter. And or fear comes up. Like there's resistance because we're so accustomed, like you were saying, we are so accustomed to consuming that it's just so kind of sort of like second nature at this point in time, that being by yourself and being in a quiet space can feel very overwhelming, you know. And I think we have to look at those kind of fears, and we have to look at the way we're using our awareness and just get really honest about it, and not in a like strict disciplinary way. No, 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 right? This actually, this kind of archetype can have a serious tone to it, but it's also actually very playful. It can be very enjoyable because, like you're saying, you go from this kind of wow, busy energy, right, to this calm, kind of centered, or much more just, it may not even be that, but just more insightful way of going, oh, okay, it's actually three main things that I need to do. The rest of it's just clutter of the mind, right? And so a lot of this, it kind of links, for me, it links back into lucidity. Maybe not in the traditional like lucid dreaming way, but definitely lucidity of presence in waking life. And so I feel like actually so many people, especially in like the self-help and spiritual community, we're all feeling that. We're really, a lot of people are coming to me and saying, you know, we're feeling like the bombardment, we're feeling that like psychic overwhelm, where actually a psychic detox is one of the best things ever, right? And so the thing is, there we need to, in a way, become accountable for that in our own lives, right? And putting those behaviors in place, or can feel difficult at first, you know. So I always say to people, if you're wanting to do this, you recognize, okay, I'm scrolling on my phone too much, maybe, or I'm listening into too many things, or even if it's enjoyable stuff, like even listening to music in the car. The other day, I always put my I always tap my phone and I'm listening to music and I love it, but I switched it off, and it was actually uncomfortable for the first couple minutes. I was like, why am I feeling so uncomfortable here? This is nuts. And I mean, we do this work for a living, so you can even imagine, you can have, even still, you can have these like kind of extreme experiences. One of the one of the psychic experiences that I share in the book, talking about cars, that I love to share with people. When I was like 26 or something, I was traveling and I was visiting family overseas, and I was driving in the car, and it was a really old car. It was my grand's like old secondhand car, like barely worked kind of thing. And I'm in the car, and there was no way to plug in a cell phone. It just was really peaceful and quiet. And I was driving, and I received clairaudiently just one sentence of "Go next Saturday." And I knew that in my body and in the receiving that it was for my grandmother. Go next Saturday. Anyway, fast forward that Saturday, and in true form in my 20s, I would receive a lot of guidance and not always act on it, and I didn't go. And my family member, one of them, ended up having a heart attack that day. And it was this such a like powerful and deeply like intense experience for me, because it reminded me that like when we're actually receiving guidance, one, we're often given the guidance to do something with it, even if that's a simple action like moving slower through your day, right? Or just having more presence, or being kinder, whatever, to your partner, right? It was really like this important moment for me in my life, because I got the guidance and then dismissed it. And so I had to take full ownership of that. But that guidance came when I was driving on a road with no music and I was moving forward. And I know that's part of what you were saying with being in the shower. Some actions naturally tend to put us into like receptive modes, and the more we work with our psychic and intuitive or mediumistic or out of body parts of ourselves, right, the more we tend to recognize what those are for us. And so we're sharing our experiences. Mine tends to come when I'm doing, it's nuts, but like now I actually enjoy folding laundry because I receive a lot of information. I don't actually enjoy folding laundry. I enjoy receiving guidance, right? So I have learned that these channels are helpful to me. But my invitation to people in with this work and with this archetype is go on that journey, and see what comes up. And here are some helpful guidelines. But if these guidelines don't work, tear them up and start again. But most of the people that I have spoken to and that I know are intuitively or like meditatively tapped in, it tends to begin with quieting the mind. So there's also, time saving kind of tips.
Yeah, and I think it's I want to come back to the story you shared and about listening when you get things, but I do agree that it is like when you're dancing with this archetype in you, and the way that like what kind of came to me when you were speaking earlier about it is almost like we need to have more, my feelings I'll say is we need to have more reverence,
Right.
right, for this, medial nature in ourselves. And think of it, I'll, because I know like my podcast audience, right, it's like I'm sure you all go to psychics and astrologers and spiritual mentors and all the different things, right? But and I'm not saying that like you don't need to, you shouldn't or whatnot, right? Like I think there's a time and a place, and sometimes it is helpful to get someone outside of you. However, I think it is also equally important to acknowledge that you have that inside of yourself, right? Like maybe you don't have all the astrology skills or whatnot, but you have the intuitive skills, and you can show up to that with a similar reverence that you would if like you booked a session with one of us, right? And be like, okay, you know what, today I'm gonna, I'm gonna go on a long drive, or I'm gonna go on a long walk on the beach, or I'm gonna meditate, or I'm gonna take a bath, and I'm just gonna open the space for quietness and see if there's anything that wants to like come through, or set an intention for, clarity around something, and see if anything comes through. um and when we just start kind of giving it that reverence, and we find those things and we say, wow, okay, once a day, I'm going to spend 20 minutes doing some like mundane household task in silence and see what happens, right? um but I wanted to talk about, because one of the things that I think I've gotten a lot with clients, I'm sure you probably hear, and I've also had a similar experience like that, where I was younger and I heard something and I brushed it off, and ended up being pretty tragic. And it's something that, I probably think about once a day, and I think, I hope that other people can avoid having those kinds of moments, because, I think sometimes when in our modern marketing of spirituality, sometimes we think about these tools as ways to make more money or grow our audience or whatever, and that's fine. They can help you do all of that. But I found that also, like, sometimes it is like with family members and, pivotal life moments. And mine also came through that was like, if I had gone, I would have gotten to see this person before they passed, right? And I didn't listen. And so I didn't. And that was like, spirit on so many levels has our back in those ways, right? Or this intuition like is trying to guide us in different ways. But I feel like for many people starting off, I mean, like, look at where we ended up and we still doubted it, right? For many people starting off, it's really hard to trust that or to know. Or maybe they feel like at some point I've gotten the thing, like, I felt like at some point I did follow it and it was wrong or whatnot. Like, how do you advise someone that's kind of like just, starting to receive things, and it's like, I don't know, let's say you had some really big plans that Saturday, or, my thing was I had like a big speaking gig. So it would have been like, a cross country flight and canceling a thing. And I was like, in my head, I was just like, this is probably just like a paranoid thought, right? But
100%. That's so funny. Well, firstly, thanks for sharing that, because I mean, we're laughing, but it's actually a painful, mine was a deeply painful experience, right? And it sounds like yours was too. And I think something that am learning and have learned through being connected, right, in the same way that I feel you are to spirit, to the unseen for a very long time, is that it's also a process and a journey, right? And sometimes we get that, what we would call right, and what I would call right as well. Like, if I could go back in time, I absolutely would have gone back that Saturday. That has not changed for me over years and years, but what I do feel is that we actually, because we're working with spirit, like in the case of the person that I shared, they died, they crossed over. And then I had opportunities that I didn't incubate, I didn't try and do this, that they came to me in my sleep and dreams. And then I had very lucid experiences. And so the relationship continued. Spirit is unbelievable like that. Our non physical essence, and I know you know this, we are really multidimensional in nature, and so it isn't necessarily about getting things absolutely right or getting things absolutely wrong. We can honor our humanness and be compassionate, I think, with ourselves and others for when we make mistakes, or what we would deem mistakes. And I think part of also adulthood is going, oh, okay, that is a mistake. Even where, and I say that for myself only, like, this isn't judgment for anyone listening. You can, and if you do view it in an entirely different way, I totally respect that. But what I'm really learning over and over is that the minute we connect with spirit, oftentimes what we're thinking about and what we're receiving are vastly, it's actually often very different. I love this story about, and I think I do share it in the book, so it's a bit of a spoiler, but I was part of the International Association for the Study of Dreams. They are a cool conference. They run a workshop or conference yearly. And I went to one of the lecturers of another dream teacher, and he was saying, he's a lucid dream teacher as well. And he was saying he kept having a lucid dream in which the symbols of the dream figures told him that he needed to reach out to a specific person that he hadn't been in contact with for like 15 years and give them a certain amount of money. And it was like, I can't remember the amount of money particularly, but he woke up from the lucid experience. He's a well known lucid dream teacher. And he's been teaching this and doing this spiritual work for many, many years, right? So he woke up and he thought, okay, that's a bit strange. I'll just note that down. And he noted it down, which you're well within your right to do when you're working with spirit, in my opinion, or you're working with dreams, right? You're allowed to feel it out. And anyway, fast forward, he has this experience 2 or 3 times. So he tells his wife, listen, I think I have to reach out to him. And I think we've got to like budget to give him this money. And so she just says yes, and that's what he does. He tracks this guy down and he manages to find him, and his friend pretty much like bursts into tears. Maybe I'm embellishing the story a bit, but he has this emotional response because his friend's father was dying, and they were under a specific amount of money to be able to build like a ramp or get a wheelchair or something in the house that was going to make a massive difference, right? And so his experience, of connecting in that non-physical way, yes, of course, it had something to do with him. It's coming through him. He's being asked in that space to do something, and it is very much of service. And he did that. And then I think, I don't know the rest of the story, but it was this very positive experience. And so I think, like you're saying, there is something about this kind of energy that taps us back into reverence. And also, what came up for me plenty whilst I was writing this book were the words right relationship, but in a way that didn't kind of feel icky to me. And I mean that in relationship, that when we're dreaming, we're actually in relationship with dreaming. When we're in nature, we're in relationship with nature. There's so much discourse about how we're like in a simulation, how, we're all these things. And I'm not even going to talk about what that is, but I think the minute we get very reductionistic about things, even if we mean that in a very positive sense, we kind of throw ourselves off balance. And so remembering that actually just even something simple like a dream that on the face seems kind of crazy, or makes you feel uncomfortable, well, that can be guidance too. And maybe that guidance isn't something that you're perceiving in your waking life. So it's coming up in sleep. And maybe it's asking you to do something that's beyond you or for someone else entirely, or maybe actually for your future self. How do you know, right? And so part of this process is just really stepping into like the mode of receiving, not giving away all your power, absolutely not, but also just being receptive to what you're hearing and listening. I think a lot of what has happened sort of as an unintentional consequence. So many of us are in like creator mode, right? We're creating content, or we're creating, work or whatever it is. And that's what we're kind of being asked to do. Society is kind of asking us to do that. Culture's even asking us to do that. And then this kind of flips it on its head. It goes, okay, well, you're not in that mode now. And what I'm telling you may be for that mode later. But actually, right now, in this moment, it's something entirely different. So I always like to say, when we show up for spirit shows up for us. But then what happens after is total unknown.
I like what you mentioned, that you're that guy, and I know you recommend this too. It's just like writing it down, right? Where it's like whether you're writing down your dreams, but also like I always encourage people to write down their intuitive hits, and especially if it's something where you're like, this feels like a little out there, or I don't know, if I'm going to listen to it or whatnot. I think one of having that like reference point to be able to be like, oh, okay, so that was what I heard and this is how that turned out, right? And naturally we're going to have times where we like go for it and times we don't, right? And I think the lesson that I spend a lot of time thinking about my non-listening episode or whatnot, and like they can be really educational moments when we don't listen, and then maybe things don't go well in some way. Um, to really look back, like, what were the factors in my non-listening and my decision-making process in that moment, in that moment, one of the things that, like, I was really available to was that I listened to my now husband, then boyfriend.
Right.
Um, and I let his, like, logic override my intuition in that moment, because that, a little bit more context, but nobody knew the pandemic was going to happen, right? So we were at, like, 3 months before, like, we were all going into lockdown, and, like, nobody was talking about COVID or anything like that. So everyone was like, you're going to see her in April, right? And logic dictated you're going to see her in April. And she was still alive in April if the world would have been opened, right? But ultimately she passed before, I was able to see her. So it was like one of those things where, like, nobody logically could have foreseen, right? And they were going back at me with, like, really reasonable logic. But one of the lessons that I've learned in that journey, but I try to take it to even smaller things, because most things are smaller than that. Like, that's like a really big one, but most of them are.
Yeah.
um
Hopefully a once in a lifetime one,
yeah, like, once in a while you get those big ones, but in the day to day, it's usually like, oh, maybe you shouldn't eat that thing, and then you get a stomach ache,
Exactly.
deal with it. But like,
Right.
but like, but I ask myself sometimes when, if it's like a hit like that, I'm like, okay, well, like, what is the potential cost here, right? And then that also, I think, for me, has helped, inform things a little bit more, right? Where if in that moment I had even just asked myself, what's the potential cost? I would have just been like, I'm just going to go. Because at the end of the day, I wouldn't have wanted what happened to happen to me, right? I would have known that it would have sucked to live with that, right? And it would be worth me canceling a thing and flying and just doing it, right? And so, like, in those little moments where you're like, okay, like, what is the cost if I'm getting this feeling? And sometimes you have to say, like, the cost might be great, like, it might be an incredible inconvenience,
Right.
but I think the beautiful thing, and you talk a little bit about the initiation period, and I want to hear, like, what you mean by that. But I think, you know from what I have, like, coached people on, is like, when we start listening to those small things that come through, the little things that, are like, call your friend. You just have, like, this idea to, like, call a friend that maybe you just have been too busy, haven't spoken to in a month, right? And you call them and they're like, oh my God, I'm getting a divorce. I can't believe, like, I'm in this, like, I need to talk to someone, right? And when we have those, like, smaller moments, we build up that muscle, and we, like, build up that confidence in ourselves to really listen when we have, like, a much more inconvenient moment.
Right. And I love everything that you're saying, because I feel like it's just very resonant and very applicable. I think so many of us can, empathize with that. And I think one of the best things to do, like you're saying, is just have like a little notebook and keep it only for psychic experiences or things that feel very intuitive. And that is just like, it's an easy way to prove to yourself, like, yes, this actually is happening. Because people often say to me, like, is your doubting voice disappeared completely? Absolutely not. It never does. My doubting mind never shuts up. It's there all the time. Like, I did an event for Hay House when my Oracle deck came out, and we had a whole lot of people online that I was doing readings for. And so I receive information psychically, like we've been talking about. And my mind before the event was like, well, what if you don't receive anything? What if everything you receive is wrong? Blah, 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 blah. But after years and years of knowing that, like, oh, okay, these little moments, like you're saying, even simple things like Sometimes I'll feel like I want to go somewhere and I'll get the feeling to just wait like 3 minutes. So now I wait 3 minutes because I'm not willing to find out what the other thing is, exactly like your question. I mean, I actually think that question is gold. What is the cost of this? And if you can't really foresee it and you're kind of getting the hint of it, well, then, what's to me, like, what's the harm? Even if you're late, even if it is an inconvenience or something that would be deemed kind of like, oh, that's not so great. What's the harm? Like, we know, or at least I think we know in our kind of realms of work, we can have precognitive experiences. They're very real and they really do happen, you know. And so depending on what the nature of them are, sometimes they're wonderful, they're really pleasant, and sometimes they're not. And so we can treat those moments of advice or guidance as helpful, and just kind of, I think also like keeping it light is very helpful. I try to keep it very light with what I'm receiving, even though it might be about something quite intense, because I find that the more serious we are about it, like I have a lot of people who come to me with this and they'll say, like, I'm trying to give psychically receive where my parking spot is going to be, or in my dream, right? And one of the examples I always give people is try and see before you open up your inbox, like if you can tell who the first email is going to be from, right? It's a nice easy
That
one.
is fun. I like that. I'm gonna play with
It's
that.
a fun one to do, right? The only thing is you do kind of entrain with your inbox. So if you're someone that gets very, like, a lot of information through your email, then I would maybe not recommend.
We cannot. No, 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 no. But I played that game with my texts or whatnot. If you have like your ping ping or whatever, and you have your phone across the thing, you hear the ping, like, who is it, before you look at your phone. It's just, I love that. That's a fun game.
Fun and easy, right? And it can happen. And also something here that I think with intuitive abilities, like we all have the capacity to get it wrong. If you're getting 7 out of 10, wonderful. If you're getting 6 out of 10, wonderful. 5 or whatever it is, right? With the part of us that judges it is the part of us that's the opposite of intuition, right? So we can thank that part of us. Thank you so much for judging my experience and helping me, whatever, but it isn't necessarily necessary,
Okay, that made me think of something that I wanted to ask you a question on, and then I forgot. You mentioned the shadow of the medial archetype. So tell us a little bit about that. What's the shadow of this? Because right now it seems all great.
Exactly. And it's a good time to speak about this. So a little back information, the analyst who came up with the name the medial woman archetype is a woman called Toni Wolf. And she was this incredible woman who people have a lot of opinions about her. I say incredible. Who lived in the 50s, and she really had this interesting, complex relationship with Carl Jung. And she wrote this beautiful little paper called The Structural Forms of the Feminine Psyche, and she mapped out the medial woman. And why this is important is because in her definition of it, she stated that a medial woman, or someone who tends to one of the 4 archetypes being medial, right, will be someone who is naturally able to understand the spirit of their times, who is naturally able to walk into a room and pick up on information, or to receive a lot of information from the collective unconscious, or like the dream world, let's say, right? And so that is wonderful. Like we've seen that those can be very helpful things to do. But if we're not in harmony or balance with the other 3 structures, we can really easily get very overwhelmed. So most medial people will often have to learn how to develop very good boundaries, because they can be very porous in nature naturally, right? So for most of the people that I know who are mediumistic in nature, or channels, or writers, or even artists, or creatives, or people who work in police work, they naturally tend to be open. so that they're, even if they're reading body language, there's a certain openness to it. And that's the shadow side of being medial. Because you're naturally or you're someone who tends to be naturally medial, you can then get engulfed by all sorts of information that has nothing to do with you, or be overwhelmed by someone's emotions when really they're not your own. And so you have to learn discernment about, oh, okay, this is my world, my space, my interior life. That's the collective that I'm experiencing. And I think currently, because we're in such a collective time of change, people who are medial may be feeling that even more. And so to really have good practices of leaning into like basic self-care practices, and then also very good boundary work in whatever shape or form that feels good to them. So that is definitively the shadow side. And I think something maybe that's also a bit unspoken, is that sometimes medial people will tend to have very like overwhelming dream experiences, about the collective, like dreaming of a tsunami, for example, or dreaming maybe of violence, even if you haven't watched anything violent, or you're not a naturally violent person, and there isn't something in your waking life that is making you feel angry that you're not like necessarily addressing. So those are parts of like the shadow side of it, and it's really very much about just taking very good care of yourself, you know. Yeah.
And I think that's a great example that you said, where because we are living in like very intense times, and so it's do you personally have a practice, whether it's a dream or a feeling or something that you're receiving, that helps you separate it and say, okay, I think that one was about the collective energy versus this is some symbolism I'm going to need to decode, right? Because tsunami could go either
Right.
way,
It could
right?
be about anything.
There's so many things that it could be. Is there any things that help you kind of discern that?
I think that I would love to have like a clean and easy, simple answer, but actually, the only thing that I have found is just it being years of practice and years of really paying attention to it. I will say though that I wake up and I tend to have a different resonant feeling state when it is of a collective nature, and it's
Mhm.
like I know my body knows, and I can receive that on waking. And so that to me has just been something that I've like managed to learn how to do. But when I was younger, it was very, very hard. And I think also you have to be very, I do a lot of, like journaling work and a lot of personal growth work, so that I'm clear about what I'm kind of bringing to the table, or at least I try to be. you
Yeah.
know,
Well, I
so
think that's, again, it kind of goes back to that, like, due diligence of like, what's the cost kind of thing, right? Where if you're like, I have this dream or I have this feeling or something's coming through, and you just kind of go through your own little checklist of like,
yeah,
does it feel like there's something that could be mirroring that in my life or something that's going on?
yeah,
And if at first glance it's like, no, I'm not, right? Like maybe it's collective. Um, there's no harm in kind of like holding it
yes,
for a bit,
absolutely,
right? And just seeing like, let me go about my day and see like if anything else comes through or,
right,
whatnot. And just, I love what you said, because I think unfortunately though, it's not
yeah,
an answer a lot of people like to hear. I think this is definitely an archetype and a part of us that we develop with practice and time and using it. And the
yeah,
more you use it, the more confident you are. And you find, I love that you said that. I find that too with myself, where we have, we all have like our unique little tells,
right,
right? Where you're like, oh, okay, that was actually because, like, I'll be at the coffee shop and, someone will like kind of brush by me and I'll like feel something of some sort or whatnot that's going on. And then I can kind of just like check through and be like, okay, wow, okay, that was something, that was coming through them. And I think, it's hard because we all have like so much going on any given day, right? So you could have also gotten like a crummy text message at the same time that person like entered your field, right? And being like, wow, do I feel that bad about this text? Right? And then you just kind of like, but I love what you said about kind of like I'm gonna butcher your words, but essentially you kind of know your natural state, so to speak, of like what your range of yourself is, and when other people kind of, or the collective is kind of infringing upon that.
And you can also ask, something that I think I've learned to do as well is that, like, if I'm unsure about something, I ask for more clarity. And so that's that took me way too long to figure out. But because I'm like, oh wow, I've just received all this information. I know it's not just general, because it kind of has a different feeling state to it. And then I would sit with it, and that's good. Like, it's helpful to sit with it. But sometimes I would sit with it in a way that was kind of would make me feel anxious. And so now I've learned to go, okay, I'm unclear about that. Just show me a little more about it. And that tends to kind of like open up the channel again. But I think for people who are starting out, it's easier to just pick really simple things and really bring it back down to mindfulness, because exactly like your example, which I love so much, most of us will walk through a coffee shop or something will happen, and we often don't even like notice. We're just like, oh, I've changed moods or something's happened, right? So part of that is becoming really mindful and going, okay, even the ability to kind of go, oh, was it the text message, or was it that person, or is it just something that in itself can change it so beautifully, so we're seeing this like beautiful movement again between like being intuitive, receiving, having healthy energetic boundaries, and then also at the same time, using your mind in ways that are helpful. So like, yeah, oh, actually it's the text message.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Athena, thank you so much for your time. The Women Who Dance with Dark, the book, it's coming out on September 17th. And if you're watching this before this, don't worry, you can pre-order. So it's delivered on its birth date. Do you have any teasers or anything else you want to let people know about the book?
I'm so excited for everyone who is interested in getting it. And if they'd like to find out more information, the best place to go is on my website. And other than that, I have a course coming up with the Shift Network, which people can check out, which is on the book, on the medial archetype, but also on dreaming and how they connect. So all sorts of fun things to be had.
I love that. We talked a little bit about that, today, about how it's funny because I was thinking about that, obviously, because I know your other books and your work that you do, and it all ties together. Of course, it all ties together. I love that. And it's great that you're doing that course for people who really want, like, hey, I'm feeling really activated by this. I think if you're listening to this podcast, if you've made it to this point in the podcast,
Yeah, exactly.
you're being told something. And this is, probably your message to say, okay, let me investigate this part of myself, and definitely get the book. And then if you feel really called to go even deeper, checking out that course, I will put all the links below, so no matter where you're listening to this or watching this, you can just click the show notes and you'll have a link to Athena's website, her Instagram, how to buy the book, all that good stuff. So thank you so much for listening. And thank you, Athena, for being on the show again.
Thank you so much. It's been so great speaking to you.